and we're going to jump straight into having a look at the system. So my intent today is to walk you through each of the features. I'm hoping to show you how you can use the system to add value, but most of all, I'm hoping to give you some knowledge and some information that you can then take away to use within your environment. And being informed about this solution is certainly going to help you to add value to your information management plans for Office 365, and also in discussions with your IT teams and IT representatives within the organisation to help to determine how you may use the solution. So to get started, we're here in the portal. So I'm just going to explain what it is. So essentially we have an online portal that we can use to manage information in our Office 365 environment. So this includes locations such as SharePoint, OneDrive, your Exchange mailboxes, Microsoft Teams can also be managed utilising this solution. And also Skype conversations and conversations and chat that happens within Teams. So to get started, we'll have a look here at our homepage. So we access the portal through a URL. The reason why we think that it's important as well is because it gives you the ability to not only view your information, you can also protect your information from prevention from being shared, unauthorized sharing, also protection from loss, protection from deletion, enables retention, enables some disposal in that environment. And it can be done at a granular level and also at a, I guess, a higher organisation level where policy can be applied across the organisation. As we go through each of the features here on the left-hand side, I'll talk more about what you can actually do with them. But what we're seeing here is the homepage of the compliance portal, or security and compliance portal, which is also another important factor. Currently, Microsoft are transitioning the security and compliance portal to be two individual portals, one for security and the other for compliance. So as we're seeing this change go through, the types of dashboards that are becoming available are very succinct or specific to either security or compliance. So what we're most interested in looking at is the compliance side from an information management point of view. And just to touch on the security elements, it's very much around threats to your Office 365 environment and pertains mainly to IT protection mechanisms and security scores, etc., to make sure that the content is being protected and that the threat of attack and so on is minimised. So here you can see I'm given a dashboard in which I have customised to give us a view of the information management specific widgets that we would use in a system like this. So you can see that I've got some information around classification. I can see top 5 labels, pending dispositions, etc. So as we go through, this terminology will start to make sense because I'll be showing you what a label is, talking through how they're used and how they're applied, and also looking at disposition and policies, etc. So the widgets here will start to become more relevant as we work through each of the features. So it's important to understand that in terms of being able to access the Security and Compliance Centre, there are permissions that need to be granted to users within the organisation. So you can see here there's a number of out-of-the-box roles that are available within the system, and somebody like your Office 365 Global Administrator will need to allocate permissions to individuals who are going to be accessing and using the Security and Compliance Centre, and that can simply be done by selecting and adding users to the group. So you can see that there's a membership of each of the groups and there's specific roles and functionality that can be used and executed when you're given a role. So that's something that needs to be considered at an organisation level as to who is given access and what they can do within the system. At the moment, I've got the highest level of privileges, so you can see that I've got access to everything. If you are given access to the Security and Compliance Centre, you may find that yours may look a little bit different, and that'll be based on the role that you're given within the centre. So let's go ahead and jump into the features and the tools and the functionality and have a look at what we can actually do. So one of the main features that is used in the Security and Compliance Centre from an information management perspective is the classifications module, if you like. So within the classifications module, we have the ability to configure labels for sensitivity and for retention. So we can see here when we click on the labels tool, we have two tabs, one for sensitivity and one for retention. A sensitivity label is a label that's used to classify and protect sensitive content. So this label does not contain retention. This label allows us to classify documents and emails created in Microsoft applications with a security label. And then using that sensitivity label, we can actually enforce some protection settings, things such as encryption, watermarks, headers and footers on content. So it enables us to actually protect our content in our Office apps. So I'm just going to open up a sensitivity label. So you can see here I've created a sensitivity structure. We have official, sensitive, protected, and public content. If I edit that label, you'll see that we have the opportunity to put some information about what the label is. So we can see that this is a tooltip for users being official information, and we also have a description about the label. The next option I have is to encrypt content using this label. If I were to choose to encrypt content, this will trigger a number of things within the system. So essentially it's going to secure and encrypt the content. But what it also does is it also will lock that content for collaboration. So it's something that needs to be taken, quite seriously as to whether or not you use encryption in your environment. But it is a feature that is available to you to place within the label. So what this means is anything that gets labelled with this particular sensitivity label, if I were to turn on encryption, and I'll just pop that on so you can see what happens, it would mean that anything that is given this label is going to be encrypted based on the conditions that are available to me in the configuration. So I have a number of options that I can choose around whether or not it's email messages and files or only email messages in Outlook. I can expire access to the content, so I can select a specific date, or I can say that it never expires, or I can put a period of time after the label is applied. And I can also control whether or not the content is allowed to be accessed offline. Here I can then go ahead and grant permissions to the users that I want to specify as being able to access that content. So encryption, as I said, is something that needs to be considered in the broader aspect of your organisation and whether or not that's something that you want to use, particularly, as I said, because it affects the collaboration within Office 365. So if you've got a number of labels where encryption's being enacted, you may find that that could impede collaboration and working in groups within the Office 365 environment on content that's been encrypted. I can also elect to place content marking on any content that is labelled with this sensitivity label. So I have the options to apply a watermark, add a header, and add a footer, and I can also customize the text. So what that does then is when a user places this label, or if this label is automatically applied to content, it will place a watermark, a header, or a footer dependent on the configuration of the label settings. So to do that, I can tick that on just so you can see what options you get, and I can add, you know, let's put in sensitive, and I can, you know, adjust the font size, the font color, and the layout, and that will then, each time the label's applied, it will apply that watermark to the document or the email. Something to consider in terms of content marking is that if you do have documents or emails that already contain either a header, a footer, or a watermark, it will overwrite and can sometimes distort that image. So careful consideration needs to be given to applying labels with content marking to things like templates or documents within your organisation that already have a header or footer, which in a lot of cases official documents within organisations already have that. So it's just important to do testing if you are going to use content marking to make sure that your documents are not going to be distorted with any existing headers or footers that are on your documents to begin with. So a few things that we can do just to sort of list them out for you is we can enforce those protection settings, so we can do encryption and watermarking. We can protect content in Office apps across different platforms and devices, which we're going to have a look at. And we can also prevent sensitive content from leaving our organisation on devices running Windows. So, sorry, I'll just take that off. Oops. Okay, so endpoint data loss prevention helps us to do that. This is where we can control emails and documents being shared either externally with other individuals or internally, and we can do that by using endpoint data loss protection. This also requires your IT department's involvement if you are looking at doing endpoint data loss protection. So when I talk about endpoint data loss, this is a feature that can be controlled at the endpoint, so at the user laptop or PC. And you can use that to apply data loss prevention policies to your Windows devices. So again, it's not specifically information management related, but it's certainly having an understanding that there's levels of control that can be applied to Windows devices through the use of endpoint data loss prevention, I beg your pardon, in sensitivity labels. So I'm just going to turn that one back off. And the last option that we have to configure in a sensitivity label is auto labeling. So this is, again, requires some additional functionality as your information protection labeling client is required to do that. And if we turn that on, we can see that we can add some conditions to ensure that this label will be automatically applied to content that meets specific conditions. So this is where, if you're wanting to take the responsibility from the end user manually applying labels and go to more of a passive or automatic labeling approach, we can do this through turning on automatic labeling, and that allows us to add conditions such as if the content contains specific information, we can then do that based on sensitive information types, or we can also have some conditions, we can also have some control around if the content matches those conditions, that we can automatically apply the label or even make a recommendation that the user does apply the label. So it helps users to understand when they should be labeling content, and it also allows you to display a policy tip to the user, so when they do come to having content that meets those conditions, they'll receive a tip on their screen in order for them to then apply that label. So I'm just going to pop up my Outlook now so that you guys can see how a sensitivity label is actually applied in the Office application. So that's a really important note in terms of when and how the sensitivity labels are applied. There's a couple of types of labels in the Office 365 Security and Compliance Centre. I'm going to be talking about retention labels, but the difference with the sensitivity label is it's actually done from within the Office applications. So you can see here under this sensitivity tab, now most of you won't have this unless the add-on has been installed. So I mentioned earlier that there are some additional features that need to be installed in your environment in order for this feature to work. And one of them is the Microsoft Office Applications add-on for Azure Information Protection, which will allow you to have this sensitivity button in the menu. And you can see here through our environment of testing, and we've got a number of different categories where we can label our content. So it does rely on the user to add that. It gives us a bar here so we can see how the content has been labeled, and the tip for the label is there. I can edit my label and change it here. Or if I was automatically applying the label, then it would show the label here if my content met the conditions of the label. So auto labeling allows us to automatically apply labels. I'm just going to cancel that. Essentially, we look at this in terms of what the users can apply, and also, you know, where we do want to automate it, we can configure our labels accordingly. So this can, for content manager users, may relate to, although it doesn't provide any level of security in terms of access and controls, it may relate to some of the security levels that you use in Content Manager, for example. These are example labels. We can also create sub-labels for sensitivity labels, and that allows us to group labels based on perhaps the sensitivity level. So we may have 3 different levels in an overarching parent level, and we can create sub-labels as a grouping. And if we go back over to my Word, you'll see here these are grouped sensitivity labels. So when we do create grouped labels, the top level label cannot be applied to the content. Only the child labels are available for applying to content. So when we do the configuration, essentially the top level label contains no settings. It is specifically a heading for the sub labels to be grouped together. There's also options where you can customize the help and feedback links to your own internal intranet sites or your security classification procedures and guidelines. That can be done through the Security and Compliance Centre to actually point your users to the specific guidelines around sensitivity labelling when they're looking for help. If the tooltips are not enough to classify correctly, they can then refer to the help that you configure and point specifically for sensitivity labels. So a couple of other important things or considerations on sensitivity labels. It's one label per item. There are clear text labels, so they will follow the content wherever it shall roam. So if it's applied to an email and that email is then stored in a SharePoint document library or other Office 365 location, the label will carry with the content. So therefore your encryption protection settings remain with the content for the life of the content, unless of course it's removed. And the other key consideration when designing your sensitivity labels in your environment is that the label priority is important. So you'll see here that I do have the option to move my label down, or if it's at a lower level, up. And this is so that when the sensitivity model is presented to the end user within the Office applications, they'll have the highest level of security first in the menu. So it does control the way in which the sensitivity labels appear in the menu. Okay, so retention labels. We'll move along because time's critical. So retention labels allow us to create our retention labels for Office 365. Retention labels can be used in Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Office 365 groups, and we can configure them to refer to any schedules that we're bound under compliance to retain our information for. So I'm just going to quickly jump in and create a label so you can see the process for doing that. So the label requires a name, a description for admins. It's important to really describe what this label's for. So I always ensure that we include in the description for administrators the retention period and also what the label's actually doing. So it may be something along the lines to say content is retained for a period and is deleted, for example. And the description for the users is used to help them understand that if they're using that label, what is actually going to happen with that content. So essentially, we make sure that the description for the users is very straightforward and explains what the label's going to do. Okay, so what we're seeing here is something that is very new in the system under an early adopter program. This is something that has not been released yet to the general public in Microsoft, so this might be a first for you in terms of seeing this. This is a way in which we can have a file plan set up in Office 365 that allows us to have specific information around our organisation in terms of unique identifiers, business function and department. So you can see here that I have some business functions set up in our environment. There's opportunities to categorise based on, again, categories within our organisation. and some authorization types, etc. I'm not going to delve too deeply into this because it's currently not generally available. If anybody wants to understand more about that, I can address that in a separate webinar or send your questions through to us, and we'll get back to you. I'm just going to jump forward to retention settings. So this is where we can actually turn on and configure the settings based on the requirements that we have to retain information. So retention allows us to set for how long the content's going to be retained. So we can select to either retain content or not to retain content. You'll see if I select that, then my options to retain content are removed. So in terms of how we retain the content, we have options to retain it either forever or for this long. So if it's permanent retention, we can select to retain the content forever. If we want to specify the period, we can determine how long we're going to retain the content for. So I'm going to leave it at 7 years, but I'll show you that there are options for days and months. And then we're required to also to state what we want to happen after that time. We can leave the content as it is, we can delete it, but what we do recommend is to trigger a disposition review, and then we can send notification emails to the persons that need to be notified that the content is due for disposition. We then need to specify when the retention period commences. We've got some options here, so you can see that the triggers are a little bit limited as to when the retention triggers. So we know that, in a lot of schedules, for example, there's content that needs to be retained perhaps from a date of birth, from a date of commencement of a contract, etc. So the granularity in terms of configuring that is a little bit limited. However, there are options, and we can also use event-based retention, which I will talk a little bit to as we move through. But essentially what event-based retention is that we can configure events within the system, for example, contract expiry as an event, and then when that event occurs, the content will be retained and managed according to the configuration settings of the label. We can also classify our content as a record using labels, and what this does is it changes the composition of the record or the content as such, and it prevents it from being edited or deleted or changed or the label removed in the environment. So very similar to what we see in traditional EDRMS. Something to be aware of around classifying records as content with this functionality is that, again, the collaboration can be affected. So if a document or content requires editing still, or you've got it in a collaborative space, then that's no longer going to work because those records are classified as labels. So consideration really needs to be given around when a piece of content is classified as a label, as a record, I beg your pardon. And you can see there I got a little error because I hadn't put in somebody to send the review to for disposition. So we get an option at the end of configuring the label that allows us to check the settings, to check the time that the retention's applied and what we're actually doing with it. And then when we're happy with that, we can create the label. So labels, we've been doing a lot of work with clients around mapping exercises for retention schedules and how labels might fit within the environment and how they may be used. They can also be automatically applied to content similar to sensitivity labels. We have the option to automatically apply a label. But the labels do need to be published before they come into effect. So they can't be used until they've been published to the environment and to the users that the labels are applicable to. And that's done under label policies. So again, a few things to think about in terms of using labels. They're used within your Office 365 environment, so a little bit different to the sensitivity labels in terms of where we apply labels. So essentially labels get applied within document libraries in SharePoint or against OneDrive content. So they're placed against the item and they can be done manually by the user, or again, we can automatically apply labels to content based on conditions. So the other important aspect of classification and labels is creating your publishing policies. So to do that, we can create a new policy. So just to show you where I went quickly, under label policies, we create a policy to publish our labels. You can publish multiple labels to multiple locations at once. So you do have the option to, sorry, I'm in a sensitivity one. I want to jump across to retention. That's another little trick to be aware of in the system is the sensitivity and retention. So make sure you're in the right place when you're doing it. Very similar in functionality. So we choose the labels that we wish to publish. We add them to the policy. We then select the locations that we want to publish the labels to. So here I'm saying who's going to be able to actually apply, well, not so much who, where are the labels going to be available for people to apply them to content. So I can go with just all locations in Office 365, or I can choose specific locations of where I want to publish my labels. So Exchange email is going to put them into Outlook, SharePoint sites, OneDrives, and Office 365 groups. And then I can also be specific if I want to apply to just specific users or specific SharePoint sites by choosing the sites. And I can tick my site there, and that's going to make these labels available within this particular SharePoint site so it can be selected and applied to content. The policy needs to be named, so I'm just going to put something in there quickly so that we can move through. Given a description, so this is where you might describe what the policy is doing, where it's applying to, and what the labels are. And then again, we get the option to review our settings. So the key things to think about around publishing labels and labels in general is that it does take time for the labels to appear to the users, so it can be a day before a user will be able to see a label in the SharePoint or OneDrive environment, etc. It also will only appear in Outlook and Outlook web apps for mailboxes that have at least 10 meg of data in them. So if you've got mailboxes that are under 10 meg, those labels won't appear to those users. Only one label at a time can be applied to content. So if content has been labeled manually by a user, then the automatic publishing of labels will not apply. It does not overwrite. So the passive approach does not overwrite the manual approach of labeling. So there's quite a few things to consider around how you configure the labels and certainly how you apply them, whether you're going to be applying them manually or whether you're going to be applying them automatically, and then your approach within your environment around education to make sure that, you know, for those for that content that is you're hoping to achieve automatic labeling, that it's not then being labeled manually. And it can take up to 7 days for those labels to be applied automatically. And what that means is that during those 7 days, your content is not labelled. So in terms of your retention, that's not going to be applied until the label actually goes onto the content. What does it do for us if we do use retention labels? It means that at any time, once the content has been labelled, if the content has been edited or if the content's deleted, it will be captured into a secure location and retained for the period that the label specifies. That location can be accessed by global admins and people that have rights. The content can be restored from there, and then it's also going to appear on your disposition reports and allow you to manage that content. So once I actually go ahead and complete this process, which I'm not going to execute, what would happen is that those labels will become visible to users in the SharePoint environment. And essentially, I'm just going to grab a SharePoint it's going to go site so that we can actually see how that's applied, because I think it's important that you can see that. So if we have a look here, I've got a SharePoint site, should be familiar to most of you. We've got some document libraries here. So when I go into the document library and select a document, within the properties of that document, I can apply a retention label. I've got it turned on here, sorry. And that's done here. So you can see that I have a field within SharePoint and that allows me to apply the label. So there's a number of labels available to me here. That means that these labels have been published to this site. You can see that I can tell the time of retention, and if I select that label, it will apply to that content until such time as it's either removed or it goes through a management cycle and the content's managed and disposed of within the environment. So you may have noticed when I was doing the configuration of the sensitive and retention labels, one of the triggers that was available to me was sensitive information types. Out of the box, this product comes with a number of sensitive information types available to us. And what this allows us to do is we can actually look for content that contains things such as an Australian bank account number, tax file number. There's also personal credit information such as credit cards, etc. This tool will actually look through content that contains that information and then apply the settings within our labels to that content. So it can be used to protect your sensitive information, ensure that it's not being shared, and also you know, give access to only persons that should be able to access that sensitive information. So classifications is a really important part of the information management tools that are available within the system. It allows us to use our compliance to then build our classification structure. So it's not a traditional classification as in a file structure that we see in most EDRMS systems. This is actually using a label approach to apply the classification, and it can be done across our Office 365 platform, within our Office applications, and then managed accordingly. And you'll see as we move through where that gets managed. Moving on, data loss prevention allows us to create policies that are applied to our environment to help identify and protect sensitive information. So we can see here that there's a couple of policies that have been configured in the system. So what this allows us to do is create a policy, again, to seek information that may be of a sensitive nature. So we have financial information again. I can select the country in which I want to look at. So there's some Australian financial data and our PCI data security standards. If we're in the medical and health industry, there's some Australian Health Records Act sensitive information that we can look for. Our privacy is also available under the Privacy Act, and we can also customise custom sensitive information that we may wish to look for. So the difference between labels and a data loss prevention policy is the policy doesn't require the content to be labelled, so the policy will apply to content regardless of a label. But having said that, we can also use labels to help in identifying that content. So let's just take a look at Australian financial data. You can see here that it's going to be looking for SWIFT codes, tax file numbers, credit card numbers, and Australian bank account numbers. The name automates because we're using an out-of-the-box feature. We can put a description in. And here we can then specify the locations that we want to protect the information. So you can see that I can protect content across Exchange, Teams, Chats and Channels, OneDrive, SharePoint, or I can specify where I want to protect the content. So here, a data loss prevention policy can be put in place at an organisational level so that it's applying across all content, or you can be specific. There's a few things to keep watch for with a DLP. So, for example, at the moment, we can't apply it to individual users. We can actually put some rules into our policy settings. So I'll just show you here. These are the locations that you can select from. Really important one, this is a recent release, is the Teams chat and channel messages. So if you are using Microsoft Teams within your organisation, and especially if you're using them with external sharing turned on, so you've got external parties coming into your organisation and utilising Teams or collaborating and working with you, we can actually apply some data loss prevention policies to team chats and channels to make sure that if any chats and channel messages do contain private information, meeting the criteria, we can make sure that that gets protected. So I'm just going to leave them all on and move to the next section. And we can see here we have some control over what's going to happen when we apply a data loss prevention policy. So it's going to find content that contains these items. We can then detect if it has been shared with people outside of the organisation or only with people inside of the organisation. And we also have the option then to use some advanced settings. Again, if we do use advanced, we lose the section up here. And here we can actually apply some rules to say that we want to customize the rules and conditions that are seeking this content. So a really important thing around customizing the rules and the conditions with data loss prevention is that the rules are given a priority based on the order that they're created. So it's really important when looking at doing data loss prevention that you consider the rules that you want to put in place in the policy, but also the order in which you create them, because once it's given a priority, and it's given it a priority when you create the rule, it cannot be changed. So the only way that you can edit that is to actually remove the rules, which obviously has, you know, more overheads in terms of managing that. So it's really important to understand that they are given a priority, and the most important thing about that is they're then executed in that priority order. So when you're looking for content with multiple rules, it's going to look in order of priority to then apply that policy. in terms of, you know, excluding and choosing locations, there are some limitations to the number of inclusions and exclusions. But essentially, what we see in terms of a data loss prevention policy is that it's applied at an all a high organisation level, so all locations essentially, because we are talking about sensitive information, we're talking about protecting it within the organisation. So it helps us from an information management point of view, it helps us identify the sensitive information across the location. So it does give you some reports, data loss prevention reports, to show you where that content is. So if you are storing content in those locations, it's always important to know that it is secure. We can prevent it from being accidentally shared. We can block access to documents shared outside of the organisation, or even just the email being sent externally. So if something does get accidentally sent externally, we can then use this to block that from being accessed. We can monitor and protect the sensitive information across all desktop versions of Excel, PowerPoint and Word. So it's quite a powerful tool. That can work in conjunction with labels, it can work in conjunction with retention policies to ensure that your sensitive information is being protected. Okay, so once we've set up our policy, then we can also go through a process where we can test it, or we can turn it on right away. So you can see here there's 3 options for how we can use a DLP. It's a good idea to test it first to check what content's going to actually come under policy. You can also apply it right away if you're confident that the policy's going to meet your needs within the environment. So I'll just go ahead and create that one so you can see what happens there. So all of these, I think I might have missed something in there, so let's just cancel that one off. So all of these features can work with each other, and it's really important to understand how they do work together, particularly when we start to move down into our data governance area and we're looking at retention policy, which we're going to move forward and do now. So data governance is a way in which we can govern and ensure compliance in our environment. So again, we're provided with a dashboard that gives us a really good overview of what's happening in our environment. So you can see that I can also execute some of these features and tools from this location. So I can create policies and labels and publish them from here. I can have a look and see what's actually happening in my environment. I can check whether my automatic labeling's working. I can see what labels are being applied by users. I get an understanding of what the most used labels are in my environment, so the top 5 labels. I can also see if anything's being classified as a record, and if we drill into each of these widgets, we get a little bit more information. So we can see that there's nothing classified as a record in this particular view, and we can also have a look at a table view, so we can actually see what the label is, what's happening with it, and how many of those, what the count is for those labels. So each of these features gives you some visibility and ability to drill down into your information. So if we have a look at the Label Activity Explorer, here we can see what's been happening in our environment in terms of label applications. So we can go back to a point in time, something to be aware of. Generally with Microsoft, there is restrictions in terms of the timeframes that this information's kept, but you can see that we do have the feature to export data and lists so that we can actually keep that if we want to, so we don't lose access to that. But essentially this Activity Explorer is just showing me what labels have been applied, when they were applied, who applied them, was it automatically applied, where the workload is, so the workload is where the label's applied. So you can see that from an information management point of view, we start to get visibility across the environment, particularly if the policies or the labels that you set up and name and describe, etc., you start to get a view of what's happening in your environment, the type of information that's being stored, etc. I'm just going to come down now to retention policies. These couple of items here, again, are part of that early adoption type stuff, so I'm not going to go into those now, but retention we will. So retention, we talked about retention labels earlier. A retention policy is very much like a data loss prevention policy. And what this allows us to do is apply policy to content irrespective of it being labelled. So if the content meets the criteria of our policy, then it will be retained for a period of time. So if we go in and have a look at creating a retention policy now, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of, why is a system like this important? It's important for you to understand that although, everybody's at different stages in their journey, and we certainly understand that a lot of organisations, as Michael mentioned in his intro, are talking about this. They're talking to us about this. Something that, just as a bare minimum is understanding that you can apply retention policies just, to prevent the loss of information, so that information can't be deleted from Office 365. So from an end user point of view, they still have the ability to, remove items from libraries, etc., just as they would now. But having a retention policy in place is going to mean that information is not permanently deleted. So this is a really good example of why, from an information management point of view, that we think that you need to understand these features. So a retention policy allows me to retain content. So I'm just going to put a name in, mandatory field, and it's going to apply it to all of the content in the locations that I say. So for example, here we can see that I want to retain the content for 7 years, and I'm going to say from when it was created. Do I want to delete it after this time? No. So it's just going to retain that content. I can also use advanced retention settings if I want to, which allows us to put in specific conditions around when the content will be kept. So the difference between these two here is I'm going to retain everything. Advanced settings is actually going to allow me to specify what gets retained, and that could be based on specific words, it could be based on specific content or sensitive information types. So I'm just going to keep that one up there. I can then, as a blanket rule, just apply it to my entire organisation. So you can see here, these are all of the options that I have. Important note on this one, if you do turn on Teams, you'll notice that all of the other options are turned off. So as soon as I turn on to retain content in my Teams channels, messages and chats, it's going to disable the alternate locations. So a really important point for retention policies is you need to have at least two, one for all of your content in Skype, Exchange, Office, OneDrive, etc., and one for your team channel messages and team chats. So what happens to content when it's under policy is that it is placed into either a preservation hold or a primary or secondary recycle bin, dependent on the system, and it can actually be either refreshed, it can be retained, managed accordingly, according to your retention policies, and also it can be then surfaced in any searching and discovery that we're doing. So it's really important to have a policy in your environment to prevent information from being deleted and make sure that it's captured within your environment. It takes around a day to apply a retention policy to your content. A couple of other really important things to think about is that often content will become subject to multiple policies. So it's really important to think about, you know, what policies you do have, the settings that are within them, and also to get an understanding of the rules that apply when content is subject to multiple policies. So for example, in some cases, it will be the oldest rule that's applied. In other cases, it will be the longest retention period that's applied to the content, depending on how many policies it's actually subject to. So a retention policy differs from a retention label. It's applied as a policy in the environment, and it's not, it doesn't require the user to apply a label, and it doesn't require the content to be labeled. It will pick it up based on the conditions of the policy. Events is where we can configure, as I mentioned earlier, specific events and event types. So you can see that I have created some here. A really popular one, or an example of a popular one, is the cessation of an employee's employment. So this allows us to then go and search for content that contains this particular employee's employee ID at the cessation of their employment and apply retention. It will also allow us to manage content that contains this particular employee's ID. It's quite a complex functionality. There's a number of things that need to be in place in order for it to work. It's not something that I can really demonstrate, but I can show you that you can name the event. So I'll just put something in there to get to the next screen. We can use event types or existing labels to trigger the event. Okay, so we may have some labels that relate to a cessation of employment. If we have a look at the event types, there'll be some here. So I've created a type for employment ended. And then I can here specify the keywords or the asset IDs. So this is where the employee ID, for example, might go into that. Other examples of where events can be used is, as I said, contract expiration. You might use it for particular asset records where the asset ID is known. So there's a lot of different events that you can do. Again, it's dependent on your organisation and the types of things, but those common things that we see, and again relates back to some of your schedule information where, for example, particular records may need to be retained for a period post cessation of employment. So event type retention can be used to manage where we don't. If you remember, I talked about not having a number of triggers up in the retention labels. This is where events can actually give you that granularity so that you can trigger retention based on something other than date modified or date created. Dispositions, this is where our destruction processes can take place. So we can see here, these are the items that have reached the end of their retention. If we click on an item, it then takes us into another menu where we can actually see what's pending, and if we had some things that were disposed under that disposition, then those items would be listed here. So dispositions is where we can actually undertake disposition reviews of content that has come to the end of its life, either through a label or through a retention policy. So data loss prevention is not doing any retention, but your retention policies and retention labels are going to then give you what's due for disposition. We can export disposition reports. We do get information that shows us what the label was or what the policy was, the retention period, who disposed of it, etc. So dispositions is where we can actually manage disposal of records in Office 365 under the retention policies and labels that we create. I'm just aware of the time, so I'm going to jump down to eDiscovery just to give you an idea of what can be done within eDiscovery. So eDiscovery allows us to create cases for perhaps legal investigations. It's where we can also place content on hold. So we can use eDiscovery to search for information. So if we have a look here at one of the cases that we've already created, we can see that this is where the functionality to place holds and undertake searches for whether it be an RTI, an FOI, a legal case, we can do that from within this location here under our eDiscovery. So we can configure holds. So in this case, we have a case for athlete injuries. We can create a hold. So this is going to go out and look at particular locations. You can see here I've got a number of options. I can go across email, messaging, Skype, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams sites, etc. to look for specific information related to athlete injuries. So I'm just going to leave it on as all. If I want to add SharePoint sites and things, I need to actually specify it. So I'll just quickly choose a group here just to show you. What that looks like. Let's go with a site. Another important one for this is it actually requires you to know the URL for a site. So generally what we do is go and grab it, pop it in, add it, and tick it. So that's going to allow me now to look across that site. You will have potentially multiple sites that you're going to be looking through. You can also turn on Exchange public folders. Once I've done that, I can then put in some conditions and keywords for the types of things that I'm looking for. So dependent on what the case is about, you would enter keywords. You can use search operators and or etc. Into this, separate, comma separated. So we just look for injury, ankle, okay, just to give some context to that. I can add other conditions. So if I want to look at specifics, so I might be looking at a specific sender, I might be looking for specific email subjects, modified types of files, etc. I can add that to my query, and then I can go ahead and create my hold. So what that's going to do is it's going to place a hold over any content that meets those query conditions and mean that then that content can't be edited, it can't be removed, it remains in place for the length of the case. So I'm not going to create that hold in there. Here's one that was created earlier. So we can see here that it's currently turned off. So we can then just go ahead and turn that hold back on again. So holds can be taken off and put back on. They can be edited and they can also be removed from the system. But they are part of a case. We can then also go and execute some searches within there. So if we have a look here, this search is looking for the word marine in content, and I can simply then go and view the results of my search, and it's going to show me the documents that contain that word. So essentially what happens with cases from an information management point of view is we set them up. So we give rights to somebody to actually create the cases. We can then allocate reviewers into a case, and then those people can log in and they can review the content under whether it be the RTI, the FOI, or the legal case. So we have some control over what content can be viewed, and then we can also utilise eDiscovery to export any content that's found from our searches, etc. To be used in a case or wherever it may be required. So e-discovery is a really important feature, particularly for information management, and particularly from the point of view that it not only does it allow you to create cases and holds, it also gives you that search visibility, which we can also do here under the search. So often the tools are available in multiple locations. So here, this is allowing me to conduct a search. It doesn't require me to set up a case. All it requires me to do is to set up my search. So if I do a new search, I can then, search for keywords and run my search. Why didn't let's go all locations. So it's quite simple, and it's going to go now and search across my entire Office 365 environment, looking for content that contains that. So that brings me to the end of our webinar. I hope that it's been useful in terms of getting some understanding. 45 minutes, and I've gone well over that, is not enough time to show all of the features and functionality of this system. Certainly, would really look forward to talking to anybody that wants to find out more, perhaps do a little bit more looking at the tool and understanding how it can be used. But hopefully I've given you some knowledge to now take away and have some discussions within your environment about how this tool may be used within your organisation to manage your information and to obtain visibility over your environment, so that you can put the appropriate controls and compliance measures in place to manage your Office 365 environment. So thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have after the session. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Raylene. It's been great and a long webinar, as you said. So for any questions that were asked during the webinar, we'll be responding to them offline. If anybody else has any questions, please send them through to info@mctish.com.au, and we'll respond to those. Just a quick note on the end. We've been having lots of conversations around different things and obviously looking for other topics for webinars. So if they're of interest, again, let us know. We've been talking things around enterprise information management and information architectures with different clients. Configuration, if that's of interest to you, as in 365 or SharePoint or Microsoft Teams. Different strategies that people are looking at, and also different articles. If you're looking for a webinar or a seminar, let us know and we'll start putting them into the queue. But again, as Raylene said, thanks for coming along today, and we'll see you next time. Cheers, bye.